The boardroom was deathly silent. The polished mahogany table, the gleaming skyline behind floor-to-ceiling windows, the rows of sharply dressed executives. None of it mattered anymore. Every eye was fixed on Rosa Martínez, the cleaning lady. They had mocked and ignored for years, but today she wasn't holding a mop. She was holding Daniel Crawford's termination papers. Across from her, the CEO himself sat frozen, his usual arrogance shattered. "You're joking," he scoffed. His voice hollow. Rosa met his gaze, unwavering. "No, Mr. Crawford," she said. "You're fired." Gasps rippled through the room. Executives exchanged nervous glances, the power dynamics shifting before their eyes. How had this happened? How had a woman they dismissed as nothing become the most powerful person in the room? To understand, we have to go back to the years of humiliation, the quiet suffering, the racism she endured, and the moment Rosa decided she wouldn't stay invisible any longer. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe in justice, hit like and subscribe for more powerful stories. Sterling & Co. was one of the most prestigious investment firms in New York City, a company built on power, prestige, and profit. The skyscraper stood tall, its glass reflecting the bustling city below, a beacon of wealth and influence. Inside, the atmosphere was just as imposing. Men in tailored suits, women in designer heels, voices sharp and commanding as deals worth millions were negotiated over morning coffee. Amidst all of it, moving silently through the corridors with a cart of cleaning supplies, was Rosa Martínez. She had worked there for over a decade, watching from the shadows as fortunes were made, reputations were destroyed, and power shifted among those who never acknowledged her presence. To them, she was invisible, just a cleaning lady. But Rosa saw everything. She saw the way the young, ambitious interns mimicked their bosses, learning early that arrogance was rewarded more than competence. She saw the way promotions were handed to those who fit the image of corporate America, white, confident, connected, while the others, the ones who looked like her, remained stagnant, overworked, underpaid, and disposable. She had long grown accustomed to the cold indifference, but nothing could prepare her for the moment. She realized that their contempt wasn't just about class. It was about race. The first time she truly felt it was at the company's annual holiday party, an event she and the other janitorial staff were required to clean up after. She was in the corner of the grand event hall, wiping down a table when she heard laughter erupt from a group of executives standing by the bar. At the center of them was Daniel Crawford, the company's CEO, his presence dominating the room. He swirled his glass of whiskey, a smirk on his face. "I swear the janitors here multiply like rabbits. Every time I turn around, there's another one," he joked. The men around him erupted into laughter. Rosa froze. The words felt like a slap. She kept her head down, heart pounding in her chest. She had endured rudeness before, but this was different. This wasn't just disrespect. It was amusement at her existence, a reminder that no matter how hard she worked, she would never be more than a joke to them. She clenched the rag in her hand, swallowing her anger. If she reacted, they would win. She had learned long ago that anger was a privilege reserved for people with power. For people like Daniel Crawford, the humiliation didn't end there. A week later, when she picked up her paycheck, she noticed it was short. It wasn't the first time this had happened, but this time she was prepared. She went to HR, waiting. Patiently outside the office of a woman named Susan Blake, the head of human resources. When Rosa finally stepped in, Susan barely looked up from her computer. "It must be a mistake," Susan said, dismissively scrolling through her screen. "You people should be grateful to have jobs at all." Rosa felt her stomach drop. "You people." The phrase lingered in the air like poison. Rosa had worked for 10 years in this building. She had watched the very walls of the firm grow taller, richer. She had cleaned the offices of men who walked past her without a second glance, men who had no idea she knew more about their daily habits than their own assistants. And yet, to Susan, she was just one of them, A faceless worker. Replaceable. Rosa swallowed the insult, clenching her fists at her sides. "It's not a mistake," she said, her voice calm but firm. "This has happened before. I need my full pay." Susan finally looked at her then, sighing as if Rosa were a burden rather than an employee asking for what she was owed. "I'll look into it," she said, but Rosa knew she wouldn't. The money wouldn't come. It never did. That was the unspoken rule here. If you were invisible, you had no voice. But Rosa wasn't going to let this go. She walked out of the office, her mind already working. If they thought she would stay quiet forever, they were wrong. Days passed, and Rosa continued her routine, blending into the background as she always did. But the injustices piled up, each one fueling the fire inside her. She overheard conversations she wasn't supposed to hear, conversations that revealed the true nature of Sterling & Co. One afternoon, as she wiped down a conference table, she listened as two executives discussed upcoming layoffs. "We need to cut costs," one of them said. "Start with the bottom-tier employees, the cleaning staff, the admin workers, the ones no one will fight for." Rosa's grip on her rag tightened. No one will fight for them. She finished her work in silence, but something had shifted inside her. The following week, she witnessed something that made her blood run cold. She had just entered the executive lounge, ready to wipe down the counters, when she saw a group of senior managers sitting around with drinks in hand. They were laughing, their voices loud and casual, as if they weren't discussing something horrifying. "Honestly, who would even notice if half the janitors disappeared overnight?" one of them joked. "They're lucky to even have jobs." Rosa felt her heart hammer against her ribs. This wasn't just about business. This was about power. About control. And it wasn't just the janitors they were targeting. It was the receptionists, the assistants, the people who made the company function but weren't seen as valuable. It was the people like her. That night, Rosa went home and pulled out the box her late husband had left her. Inside were stacks of documents, old investment papers, things she had never truly understood. Until now. Her hands trembled as she sorted through them, her breath catching when she saw the company's name printed across several of them. Sterling & Co. And then she saw it. The truth. Rosa wasn't just an employee, she was the majority shareholder of the company. Her late husband, Miguel Martínez, had once been an investor, buying shares when the company was still small. Over the years, those shares had grown, accumulating into a controlling stake. When Miguel passed away, they had been transferred to her. Rosa stared at the papers, her mind racing. All these years, she had been working as a cleaning lady in a company she technically owned. And no one had ever realized it. Until now. The weight of it crashed over her. The anger, the humiliation, the years of being ignored, laughed at, spoken down to, the paychecks that were short, the racial slurs disguised as jokes, the way she was treated as if she didn't matter. She mattered, and she had power, more power than Daniel Crawford, more power than Susan Blake, more power than every executive who had ever looked through her like she wasn't even there. Rosa sat at her small kitchen table, gripping the documents in her hands. The fire inside her burned brighter than ever. They had spent years underestimating her. That would be their biggest mistake. Rosa moved through the hallways of Sterling & Co. as she always did, unseen and unheard. But this time she carried a secret. She was no longer just the cleaning lady who scrubbed floors and emptied trash cans. She was the majority shareholder of the very company that treated her like she was nothing. But knowing the truth and using it were two different things. She had to be careful. She had to be smart. Every day she gathered more information, her ears sharp, her eyes always scanning. And then the moment came that pushed her closer to the edge. It was late afternoon, and Rosa was cleaning the executive conference room when a group of managers strolled in, talking loudly about an upcoming restructuring plan. At first she didn't pay attention, but then she heard a phrase that made her freeze. "We need to clean house, and I mean really clean house," said Stephen Clark, one of the senior executives. "The board wants to see more efficiency. That means cutting dead weight." The others laughed, nodding in agreement. One of them smirked. So we're starting with the janitors? Rosa felt her stomach twist. Not just them, Stephen replied. We're slashing across the board. The secretaries, the assistants, the minority hires who don't pull their weight. You mean the ones that were only hired so we could check a diversity box? Another voice chimed in. Exactly, Stephen said, chuckling. Honestly, who even notices them? They should be grateful they lasted this long. Rosa's hands clenched into fists around the rag she was holding. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. They didn't notice her standing there. They never did, and that was their mistake. She committed every word to memory. If they thought she would let this slide, they were wrong. But her anger turned to steel-cold resolve when she saw the document left on the table. It was a list of planned layoffs, and next to every name was a brief note. Too old, too foreign, doesn't fit company culture. Rosa scanned the names and saw something that made her blood boil. Maria Santos, Hector Rivera, James Okafor, Linda Chen. They were all employees of color. They were all being targeted. The next day, Rosa took a deep breath and did something she never thought she would do. She walked into Susan Blake's office without knocking. The HR director looked up, surprised and irritated. "Can I help you?" Susan asked, barely disguising her disdain. Rosa placed the list on the desk. "I found this in the conference room." Susan glanced at the paper and shrugged. "This is confidential. Where did you get it?" "Doesn't matter," Rosa said. "What matters is that it's legal. You can't fire people based on race." Susan let out a sharp laugh. "Oh, come on, don't be dramatic. Layoffs happen all the time." Rosa's voice was steady, but her hands trembled with rage. "This isn't just layoffs. This is discrimination." Susan leaned forward, her smile tight and condescending. "Listen, Rosa. I don't know what you think you're trying to do, but this isn't your concern. You're a janitor. Stay in your lane." Rosa felt the sting of the words, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she picked up the document and walked out without another word. They were trying to erase people like her, like Maria, like Hector. But she wasn't going to let that happen. Not now. Not ever. Later that evening, Rosa saw something that pushed her over the edge. She had just finished mopping the hallway when she heard Daniel Crawford's voice. She turned the corner and saw him standing near the elevators with two board members. One of them was laughing. "And then she actually thought she had a say in company policy," Daniel said, shaking his head. Rosa's blood ran cold. Were they talking about her? "People like that," Daniel continued, "don't get to make demands. They exist to clean up after us. Nothing more." The men laughed as they stepped into the elevator. Rosa stood there, gripping the handle of her mop so hard her knuckles turned white. She had endured a lot in her years at Sterling & Co. She had swallowed insults, ignored slights, and accepted that she would never be more than an invisible worker. But now she knew she had power, and she was going to use it. The only question was how. Comment number 1, if you think Rosa was right to stand up for herself and her co-workers. Should she confront Daniel Crawford directly, or is there another way to make him pay for his arrogance? And what will happen when she finally reveals the truth about who really owns Sterling & Co.? Stay tuned to find out. Rosa had spent the last decade at Sterling & Co. swallowing her pride, keeping her head down, and pretending not to hear the insults thrown her way. But this time, something inside her snapped. The weight of their arrogance, their cruelty, their indifference, it was unbearable. And it all came to a head one morning in the executive wing. She had been called in to clean Daniel Crawford's office after an early morning meeting. It was routine, the kind of mindless work she had done 1,000 times before. But today was different. Today she had seen the layoff list. Today she knew they were planning to fire people like her, people who had worked twice as hard for half the recognition. And today she wasn't in the mood to be treated like furniture. As she entered the office, she barely had time to set down her cart before she heard voices behind her. The door swung open, and Daniel Crawford himself strode in, followed by 2 junior executives. They barely acknowledged her presence, which wasn't surprising, but then something happened that pushed her to the edge. One of the junior executives, Michael Green, accidentally bumped into Rosa's cart, knocking over a bottle of cleaning solution. The liquid spilled onto the expensive marble floor, spreading in a small puddle near Crawford's desk. Michael turned, frowning, and then his eyes landed on Rosa. "Watch it!" he snapped, as if she had done something wrong. Rosa straightened, feeling the heat rise in her face. She hadn't even been near him, but before she could respond, Crawford glanced at the mess and let out an exaggerated sigh. "Are you kidding me?" he said, shaking his head. His gaze landed on Rosa, full of condescension. "Clean this up now." His tone wasn't just dismissive. It was the kind of voice you used when talking to something beneath you, something disposable. Rosa felt her hands tighten into fists at her sides. She had spent years in this office, silently absorbing every slight, every whispered insult, every moment where she was treated as if she didn't belong. And now, standing here, watching these men laugh at her expense, she had enough. But before she could say a word, Michael scoffed and muttered under his breath, "They really will. Let anyone work here, won't they?" Crawford chuckled. "Well, you know how it is. Gotta fill those quotas." The laughter that followed was like a slap to the face. Rosa's breath came fast, her vision sharpening as something inside her shifted. She wasn't just angry. She was furious. She was done being silent. She was done letting them believe they were untouchable. And most of all, she was done pretending she wasn't in control. But she forced herself to stay calm. She bent down, not to pick up the mess, but to steady herself. Because if she said what she really wanted to say at that moment, if she told them who she really was, it wouldn't be nearly as satisfying as watching their faces when she exposed them in front of the entire board. So she did what she always did. She straightened, gave a small nod, and picked up the rag. Crawford smirked, satisfied, and turned back to his desk. As she wiped the floor, her mind was already miles ahead. She had the documents. She had the proof. And now she had the motivation. She wasn't just going to take back her power. She was going to burn everything they thought they knew to the ground. That night, Rosa sat alone at her small kitchen table, the dim light casting long shadows across the walls. The documents her late husband had left her were spread out before her, each one a silent reminder of the truth she had only recently discovered. She traced her fingers over the company's name, Sterling & Co., printed in bold letters on the ownership papers, a surreal feeling settling in her chest. For 10 years she had worked as a cleaning lady in a company that she unknowingly owned, and now she finally understood the magnitude of the power she held. The insult from Crawford, the laughter from his executives, the sneering tones that had followed her through the hallways for years. It was all fuel to the fire that burned inside her. They had mocked her, dismissed her, humiliated her, but none of them knew that she held the power to destroy them. She picked up her late husband's notes, scanning them again. Miguel had been a quiet investor, someone who had believed in the company when it was still struggling to establish itself. He had poured everything into it, trusting that one day it would be a legacy for their family. But Miguel had passed before. He could see what Sterling & Co. had become, a rotting empire of greed, corruption, and discrimination. And now, it was in Rosa's hands to decide what to do with that legacy. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone. She needed help. She wasn't a businesswoman, she wasn't an executive, and she had never set foot in a boardroom for anything other than wiping down the tables after meetings ended. But she wasn't alone. She had friends, people who had been pushed aside, just like her. She dialed the first number, Carlos Herrera, a former financial analyst at Sterling & Co., who had mysteriously been fired 3 years ago. Rosa had always suspected it was because he had uncovered something he wasn't supposed to. But at the time, she hadn't had the resources to ask questions. Now she did. Carlos picked up on the second ring, his voice cautious. "Rosa?" "Carlos," she said, gripping the phone tighter. "I need your help." There was a long pause. Then in a low voice he asked, "Is this about Sterling and Co.?" "Yes." Another pause, then with a quiet certainty he said, "Tell me everything." Over the next hour, Rosa explained everything, what she had overheard, the list of layoffs, the blatant racism, and finally, the shocking truth of her ownership. Carlos didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice carried a note of something Rosa hadn't heard in years. Hope. "Rosa, do you realize what this means?" he said. "You can take them down. You can fix this." "But how?" she asked. "I don't know anything about corporate takeovers or board politics." "You don't have to," Carlos said. "You have the power. You just need the right people behind you, and I know exactly who to call." Over the next few days, Carlos introduced her to a network of former employees, legal experts, and financial analysts, all people who had been wronged by Sterling and Co. Some had been fired unfairly, others had left in disgust, but every single one of them had a story to tell about the corruption at the heart of the company, and all of them were ready to fight. Rosa worked harder than she ever had in her life. She spent her nights poring over financial reports, uncovering fraudulent expenses, manipulated stock values, and hidden HR complaints that had been buried to protect executives. With Carlos's guidance, she compiled a portfolio of evidence so damning that no board member would be able to ignore it. But she wasn't just preparing to expose the corruption, she was preparing to take control. Because if she owned the company, then she had the right to decide who ran it. And that meant firing Daniel Crawford. The thought sent a thrill down her spine. The man who had treated her like trash, who had laughed at her existence, who had spoken about cleaning house, as if hard-working employees were nothing more than inconveniences. He would be the one escorted out by security. But there was still one problem. She needed one more piece of leverage. She needed to ensure that when she stepped into that boardroom, there would be no way for Crawford to fight back. And she knew exactly where to look. The executives at Sterling and Co. had one fatal flaw. They were careless. They never imagined someone like Rosa could pose a threat. And that was why, when she walked into Crawford's office the next evening under the guise of cleaning, she wasn't stopped. The room was empty. The security cameras were positioned only at the doors, leaving blind spots near the filing cabinets and Crawford's desk. Rosa moved quickly, scanning the papers left haphazardly on his desk. Most of it was financial jargon, reports, projections, routine documentation. But then she saw it. A contract, and not just any contract. It was an off-the-books agreement between Sterling and Co. and a shadow investment firm that specialized in shady dealings. The document confirmed everything she had suspected. Crawford wasn't just running a racist, toxic workplace. He was committing financial crimes. Rosa didn't hesitate. She took out her phone and snapped picture after picture. This was it. This was the final piece she needed. She had the power. She had the evidence. And now she had the plan. In 3 days, the annual shareholders' meeting would take place, the one meeting where Crawford and his executives would present their vision for the company's future. But this year, Rosa was the future. She was going to walk into that meeting, drop every piece of evidence she had onto the table, and watch as the entire room realized the cleaning lady they had ignored for years was now their boss. The thought made her heart pound. This was happening. It was really happening. For the first time in years, Rosa felt powerful. She wasn't invisible anymore, she was unstoppable. Comment number 1 if you believe Rosa is making the right move by preparing to expose Crawford. But what will happen when she finally steps into that boardroom? Will the executives side with her, or will Crawford have one last trick up his sleeve? Stay tuned to find out. The morning of the shareholders' meeting arrived with an eerie stillness. The towering glass building of Sterling and Co. gleamed under the sunlight, an illusion of perfection hiding the rot within. Inside, the executives moved through the halls, with their usual confidence, their voices filled with discussions of profits and projections, oblivious to the storm that was about to descend upon them. Rosa Martínez, as always, walked in unnoticed, but this time she wasn't pushing a cleaning cart. She wasn't dressed in her usual dark green uniform. She wasn't moving with the quiet obedience they had come to expect. Today, she was here to claim what was hers. She had spent the past week meticulously preparing, assembling her evidence, securing legal support, and ensuring that every board member would receive a copy of the documents she had gathered. The corruption, the discrimination, the financial fraud, every single offense they had committed was about to be laid bare. And standing at the center of it all, waiting to face his downfall, was Daniel Crawford. Rosa entered the executive boardroom just as the meeting was set to begin. The long, polished table was surrounded by the most powerful figures in the company, their expressions unreadable as they glanced at her, some confused, others irritated. Daniel Crawford sat at the head of the table, leaning back in his chair, the picture of untouchable authority. He barely spared Rosa a glance, assuming she was there to serve water, to wipe the table, to do something beneath their notice. But Rosa didn't move toward the catering station. She stepped forward and placed a thick folder onto the center of the table, its presence commanding attention. A murmur rippled through the room. Some of the board members exchanged glances. Crawford sighed audibly, his irritation visible as he finally turned his gaze on her. "We're in the middle of something," he said dismissively, his tone laced with boredom. "If you're here to clean up, do it later." Rosa didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She met his gaze, and for the first time in years, he actually looked at her. "I'm not here to clean, Mr. Crawford," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. "I'm here because I own this company, and as majority shareholder, I'm calling for your immediate removal." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. The air shifted. Faces paled. A few board members leaned forward, their confusion turning to sharp interest. Crawford's smirk faltered for the first time. His fingers twitched against the armrest of his chair, but then he let out a scoff, shaking his head as if this was a joke. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing," he said, forcing a laugh, "but let's be serious. This isn't your place." Rosa pulled out the first document. It was a certificate of ownership, clearly detailing her controlling stake in Sterling & Co. She slid it across the table with deliberate calm. "This is my place," she said. "It always has been." A pin-drop silence followed. The board members began flipping through the documents, their expressions shifting from confusion to realization, to shock. Crawford's smirk was gone now, replaced by something colder, something desperate. But Rosa wasn't finished. She pulled out another set of documents, this time the evidence of the illegal dealings, the fraudulent financials, the buried harassment claims, and the planned discriminatory layoffs. The weight of it all landed on the table like a final crushing blow. Rosa let the silence stretch, watching as the reality of the situation dawned on them. The company's top executives had spent years mocking her, dismissing her, treating her like she was nothing. And now? Now she had their entire future in her hands. Crawford lunged for the documents, flipping through them with increasing urgency. His face turned ashen as he realized just how damning the evidence was. He looked up at Rosa, and for the first time since she had known him, there was fear in his eyes. This is nonsense," he stammered, his usual composure crumbling. There's no way." But he wasn't in control anymore. Rosa turned to the rest of the board, addressing them with the authority they had never thought she possessed. "I have gathered extensive proof of misconduct under Mr. Crawford's leadership, financial fraud, discriminatory hiring and firing, practices, workplace harassment that has been systematically covered up. And worst of all, the blatant disregard for the employees who have built this company from the ground up." Some of the board members shifted uncomfortably. Others looked at Crawford, their expressions unreadable. Rosa didn't let them look away. She placed her hands on the table, leaning forward slightly, her voice cold and certain. "I have the legal power to vote him out, and I will." The room erupted into chaos. Board members scrambled for their phones, whispered urgently to each other, flipped through the evidence in disbelief. Crawford slammed a hand on the table, his face contorted with anger. "You don't understand how this works," he spat. "This isn't just about paperwork. I built this company. You can't just... You didn't build this company." Rosa cut him off. Her voice was sharp, final. "The people you ignored built it. The employees you underpaid. The workers you disrespected. The people you treated like they were nothing." She looked him in the eye, holding his gaze with unwavering certainty. "But you're the one who's nothing now." A heavy silence followed, and then one of the senior board members cleared his throat. "We need to vote," he said simply. The vote happened swiftly, and it wasn't even close. Daniel Crawford was removed as CEO on the spot. The very man who had treated Rosa like she didn't exist was now the one being erased. The moment security was called, Crawford's rage turned to panic. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, his face red with fury. "You can't do this," he snapped. But no one was listening anymore. 2 security guards entered the room, waiting for the signal. Rosa gave them a nod. They stepped forward, firm hands on Crawford's arms. And just like that, he was escorted out of the building, the same way he had once watched others be thrown out without a second thought. Rosa stood tall, watching as he disappeared down the hallway, and for the first time in years, she felt free. But this wasn't over yet. Now, the real work began. Now it was time to rebuild. The news of Daniel Crawford's removal spread through Sterling & Co. like wildfire. The once untouchable CEO, the man who had ruled through fear and arrogance, had been dragged out of the boardroom in front of the very people he had spent years belittling. Executives whispered in hushed tones. Employees passed along the shocking news in hurried conversations, and those who had suffered under his reign exchanged glances filled with both disbelief and cautious hope. But the biggest shock of all wasn't just his firing. It was the revelation that Rosa Martínez, the woman they had dismissed as just a cleaning lady, was the company's true majority shareholder. The woman they had ignored, the one who had walked their halls for a decade unseen, now owned everything. The very next morning, Rosa walked into the building, not in her cleaning uniform, not pushing a cart, but in professional attire. Her shoulders squared, her presence commanding in a way no one had ever imagined possible. And for the first time in 10 years, people noticed her. Employees stopped what they were doing, watching as she strode past them. Some exchanged awkward glances, others nodded in silent respect. But one thing was clear: Sterling & Co. had changed overnight. Rosa wasn't here for revenge. She wasn't here to gloat. She was here to fix what was broken. And it started with the people. Within hours of stepping into her new role, she called for an immediate review of HR policies. The layoff plans that Crawford and his executives had drafted, the ones targeting minority employees, older workers, and anyone who didn't fit their vision of corporate perfection, were scrapped on the spot. Instead, Rosa issued a new policy. No more silent firings, no more racial discrimination hidden behind corporate jargon, and no more treating employees like disposable assets. She called for a pay review for the cleaning staff and support workers, the very people who had been overlooked for years. Within a week, wages were increased, benefits were improved, and the janitorial team that had been treated like ghosts now received salaries that reflected their importance. Rosa didn't just change the financial structure, she changed the culture. For the first time, employees felt seen. Department heads who had previously dismissed workers based on bias were forced to attend mandatory diversity and ethics training. Sterling & Co.'ers wasn't just going to pretend to be inclusive for the sake of public image anymore. It was going to become the company it had always claimed to be, but Rosa knew changing the culture wasn't enough. The real issue had always been at the top, a leadership team that had allowed corruption, discrimination, and abuse of power to thrive unchecked. She met with the board, making it clear that their complicity had nearly destroyed the company. Some resisted. Some tried to undermine her authority, insisting she didn't have the experience to run a billion-dollar firm. Rosa let them talk. Then she calmly laid out her plan. The days of rewarding corruption were over. The financial crimes Crawford had committed, they were being turned over to federal investigators. The unethical expense reports, the hidden sexual harassment complaints, the shady deals that had drained company funds, all of it was being exposed. And anyone on the board who had been part of it had one chance to resign quietly or face full accountability. The room had never been so silent. Within 48 hours, 3 senior executives submitted their resignations. Those who remained understood one thing very clearly. Rosa Martínez was not to be underestimated, but she wasn't just tearing things down, she was building something better. She introduced a company-wide whistleblower protection policy, ensuring that no employee would ever be punished for speaking out against unethical practices again. She launched a mentorship program for minority employees and junior staff, opening doors for those who had been systematically shut out of leadership positions. And for the first time in the company's history, she established a community fund, investing in scholarships, small business grants, and career development programs for underprivileged communities. Sterling & Co. had been built on greed, exclusion, and silent suffering. Now, under Rosa's leadership, it would be rebuilt on justice, integrity, and opportunity. But not everyone was ready to accept the change. There were whispers in the upper levels of the company. Some of the remaining executives resented her, unwilling to accept that a woman, a Latina, a former janitor, was now sitting at the head of the table. Some had already begun plotting ways to push her out. Rosa knew it. She could feel the tension in meetings, see the forced smiles, hear the murmurs when she entered the room. But she had spent years watching, learning, preparing. And if they thought they could silence her now, they had no idea who they were dealing with. She had already won the first battle. Now she was preparing for the war ahead. Rosa stood by the window of her new office, looking out at the city skyline, the towering buildings stretching far beyond what she once believed was possible for someone like her. Just weeks ago, she had been pushing a cleaning cart down these hallways, invisible to the very people who now hung on her every word in board meetings. It was surreal, yet it felt inevitable. The weight of her new position settled over her shoulders, heavy but not unwelcome. She had spent too many years carrying burdens that were never hers to bear, swallowing injustices she had been powerless to fight against, until now. The company was changing, and though the shifts were slow, they were undeniable. Workers who had once kept their heads down out of fear now walked through the halls with newfound confidence. Conversations that had once been whispered in break rooms were now discussed openly in leadership meetings. Those who had suffered in silence were finally being heard. But Rosa knew better than to believe that victory meant safety. Power had a way of making people desperate, and she could feel the undercurrents of resistance within the company. Some of the old executives still resented her, viewing her leadership as an insult rather than a transformation. They smiled in meetings, nodded at her directives, but Rosa had seen enough in her years of being ignored to recognize what was truly happening beneath the surface. They were waiting, watching, planning. There was no doubt in her mind that they would try to remove her, using every trick in the book to frame her as incompetent, unqualified, undeserving. They had underestimated her before. They would not make that mistake again. Rosa had spent her entire life fighting battles others never saw. She had fought to survive in a country that had tried to push her into the margins. She had fought to keep a roof over her children's heads after Miguel had passed. She had fought against every insult, every dismissal, every reminder that people like her were supposed to stay small, stay silent, stay in their place. And she had won. She had won without ever raising her voice, without ever demanding to be seen. She had won by watching, by listening, by knowing exactly when to strike. This was no different. The people who opposed her still believed that power belonged to them. They thought that leadership was about control, about domination, about fear. They had no idea what real power was. Real power was the janitors who kept the building running, while the executives sat in air-conditioned meetings, never thinking twice about who made their comfort possible. Real power was the secretaries who knew every deal before it happened, every scandal before it broke, yet were never given credit for holding the entire structure together. Real power was the overlooked, the dismissed, the underestimated, the people who saw everything because no one bothered to see them. And that was why Rosa wasn't afraid. She was surrounded by people who had spent their lives being invisible, people who had learned how to move unnoticed, how to listen without being heard, how to gather truths that others threw away as insignificant. Those were the people she trusted. Those were the people who would help her rebuild. Because Rosa knew one thing for certain. The downfall of the old world always began with those they ignored. And by the time they realized their mistake, it was always too late. She turned from the window, stepping away from the skyline and back into the reality she had created. She wasn't going anywhere. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. Sterling & Co. had belonged to people like Daniel Crawford. For too long, now it belonged to her, and she was just getting started. Rosa Martinez's story is more than just a tale of revenge or poetic justice. It is a reminder that power does not always belong to those who seem to hold it. It belongs to those who refuse to be erased, those who endure, those who watch and wait for the right moment to rise. For years, Rosa was invisible to the people who controlled Sterling & Co. They mocked her, ignored her, and believed she was insignificant. But their arrogance blinded them to the truth that had always been right in front of them. That power is not just about position or wealth, but about resilience, knowledge, and timing. The most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate the quiet ones, because the quiet ones are watching. The quiet ones remember. The quiet ones strike when no one expects them to. Rosa's journey teaches us that justice is not always immediate, but it is always possible. The workers they dismissed as replaceable, the voices they silenced, the people they treated as unworthy. They were the ones who built the foundation of that company, and in the end, they were the ones who reclaimed it. But this story is not just about Sterling & Co. It's about every workplace, every system, every institution where power is hoarded at the top, while those at the bottom are ignored. It is about the millions of people like Rosa who work tirelessly behind the scenes, keeping the world running while being treated as if they don't exist. It is about the importance of standing up, even when the world tries to push you down. And most importantly, it is about never accepting the place others try to assign to you. Because Rosa was never just a cleaning lady. She was never just an employee. She was the real power in that building, and the moment she realized that, everything changed. So now, let me ask you, have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever felt invisible, only to prove everyone wrong? Comment below and share your story. If you believe in justice, resilience, and standing up for what's right, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more stories like this, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for watching, and remember, never underestimate the quiet ones. See you in the next story.